Welcome back to the Banderpod, the percipient and perspicacious podcast of Bandersnatch books. We're a small press publisher of treasures found off the beaten path for lovers of all that is good, true, and beautiful. I'm SDG Morgan, and today I'm your host for our final episode of Season 2. Don't worry, we'll be back soon, but for today I'm going to introduce you to a new kind of episode for the Banderpod. This is our first literary readings episode, and in it you're going to hear Matthew Mellema read the first chapter of his brand new book, Red Rex. If you like what you hear, we'll include a link to the pre-order. In addition to that sneak peek, we're going to include Carolyn Claire Givens reading the first chapter of her middle grade novella, The King's Messenger, and Rachel S. Donahue reading a few of her poems from Beyond Chittering Cottage. Their full works can be found on our website, link in the show notes. Without further ado, here's Matthew Mellema.
Red Rex, Chapter 1, by Matthew Mellema. Looking back, I should have been more concerned about the Tyrannosaurus Rex. But in my defense, it was an inconvenient time for Rex sightings. I was practicing my sword defenses in the pasture. Left, right, flick, and thrust. Left, right, flick, and thrust. Groaning, I tossed the stick aside. The movements felt wrong. My only scroll on swordplay was vague on the position of the elbow. No matter how much I tinkered, it stuck out awkwardly. I would never pass the exam at this rate. Down below, the herd bleated. They lumbered from a clump of trees along the pasture's edge. The guard raptor, Ram, shot into action, bounding down the hill with a roar and a snarl. I shook my head. Probably nothing. Some stray raptor. Footnote from Matthew Mellema. Sir Alfred calls these creatures by their Cosmosan name, Gawa. Some lived wild in packs, while others were domesticated. The domestic ones came in a variety of sizes and shapes, and functioned like our dogs. They did everything from hunting, to retrieving, to herding livestock, to guarding estates, to sitting on rich people's laps. They all walked on two legs, had sleek snouts and long tails, and were covered in feathers. They were clearly something like velociraptors, so I've called them all raptors. End of footnote. Then I thought of those Rex rumors. Footnote number 2 from Matthew Mellema. Their Cosmosan name is Sarco, but these monsters were obviously tyrannosaurs. They were about 15 feet tall at the hip and about 40 feet long from snout to tail, though there were legends of larger ones deep in Cosmos's interior. They had huge heads, walked on 2 feet, and had small arms. So, yeah, Tyrannosaurus. In the story, I've shortened their name to Rex. End of footnote. Sighing, I grabbed my spear and trudged down the hill. The Rex sightings should not have been happening. My home village, Leap, hadn't seen one in generations. Giant dinosaurs like that usually stayed in Cosmos's dark interior. The only exceptions were occasional rogues, which we Cosmosans called Red Rexes. But even they shouldn't venture all the way out to Leap. Only some calamity could have driven them there. Ram paced along the edge of the pasture. By any standard, Ram was terrifying. A bulky neck framed by a mane of feathers, talon-tipped arms, and scythe claws on each foot. The herd, meanwhile, came lumbering toward me as I plodded toward Ram. Stegos can be unpredictable when they're frightened. Footnote number 3 from Matthew Mellema. A common livestock animal in Cosmosa, their Cosmosan name is Tetu. With their small heads, broad backs covered in plates, and tails armed with 4 spikes, their description matches the Stegosaurus, which I've shortened to Stego. Cosmosan stegos seem smaller than stegosaurs from the fossil record. Cosmosan stegos were barely larger than an ox, while stegosaurs from the fossil record were around 30 feet long. It's unclear whether this was a gradual change through the millennia or something Cosmosan herders specifically bred for. End of footnote. But I was used to it. I'd guarded this herd all day, every day, for the past 7 years. The herd belonged to a man named Elias, a distant relative who took me in as an orphan. The stegos rolled by with nervous energy. The plates along their arched backs sparkled in the dying light. Their tails swished in circles. Stego tails are supposed to have 4 long spikes at the end, but those spikes would have made herding them deadly, so we herders shaved them down. I ducked and dodged my way through the herd, counting them as I went. There were 19 instead of the usual 20. I ran through the list of stegos in my mind. Of course, it was Breeze. The young male was too bold for his own good, and with his spikes newly shorn, he was helpless against predators. I now realized what Ram was pointing at, a newly trampled path into the wilderness. Because of the Rex sightings, Leap's village elder had forbidden anybody from entering the wilderness alone. Footnote number 4 from Sir Alfred Lemon. The position of village elder was common in small communities like Leap. They functioned somewhat like a judge combined with a mayor. Duties included settling minor disputes between villagers, approving new building projects, and ensuring the community's safety. The elder was chosen by a council of the village's oldest and most respected citizens. End of footnote. I'd be within my rights to wait until my cousin, Jeppa, returned from his errands. But I knew I wasn't going to do that. Breeze was my favorite stego in the herd. I couldn't leave him in the wilderness by himself. Plus, the other day I'd promised Elias I would keep special watch on the young stegos who'd recently had their spikes shaved. I whistled a command to Ram. With a tilt of his head and a flare of his nostrils, he ran back to his favorite granite outcropping to survey the herd. With the other stegos as safe as I could make them, I tightened my spear grip. I took a final deep breath before plunging into the wild domain of the dinosaurs. It wasn't hard to follow Breeze's path. The snapped branches and bent vines led over a shallow hill. At the bottom of that hill, Breeze bent his neck toward the creek. He lapped up water greedily, oblivious to the world around him. I shimmied down the hill. The stego greeted me by nuzzling his snout into my palm. I patted the green leather of his head until his tail started to wag. Grinning, I snuck him the last apple out of my tunic. He may have escaped the herd, but he was still a good boy after all. It only took one gentle smack on his flanks to send Breeze waddling back up the hill. I was just about to follow him when my eye stopped on something. A deeper shadow in the dark of the forest. I leveled my spear and crouched. I almost heard the scratch of talons against stone. A half shadow dropped behind a boulder. A branch rustled. Silence. I realized I'd been holding my breath. With a shake of my head, I followed Breeze toward the pasture. The stego meandered back into the herd like nothing had happened. I chuckled and rolled my eyes. But my good mood evaporated when I scanned the pasture for Jeppa. He should have been here by now. I needed his help to gather the herd in time for the next day's trip. He may have been Elias's son, but that didn't give him the right to abandon me. The setting sun cast long shadows on the surrounding hills. This pasture was a tiny island in a dense ocean of trees. The only sounds were the wind through the branches and the bellows from the herd. I suppose I should have been afraid to be so alone. Any instant, one of those red Rexes could have burst from the trees and torn the flesh off my bones. Footnote number 5 from Sir Alfred Lemon. Cosmosan sources disagree on the origin of the term red rex. A bestiary from around 300 BC claims that red rexes have a feathered mane of a more brilliant red than typical rexes. A chronicle from around 275 BC claims the term came from the beast's reputation for wild fits of temper and the Cosmosan connection of rage with the color red. This chronicle went on to give what is, to me, the most plausible explanation. When a red rex invaded herds and started gorging on livestock, the last thing the terrified herders saw before fleeing would be the rex's snout covered in blood. End of footnote. But I learned to be comfortable by myself. To Elias, my job was to guard his herd and stay out of sight. If some rex did eat me, Elias would only grumble about having to find a new herder. The stegos were still jittery. Strange. As I reached the hilltop, I shielded my eyes toward the distant sea. Because it was clear, I could just catch the last rays gleaming off the imperial towers of Javriel, the great city, where the powerful feasted in their seaside villas, where young dinosaur riders trained for greatness. My future home, assuming I could pass the imperial exam. I sighed as I searched for Jeppa across the meadow. Nothing except Ram, who was running and snorting along the tree line. What was with him today? Sitting down, I tried to keep my hands folded on my lap as I watched the sunset. But with each passing moment, my blood boiled hotter. I needed Jeppa if I was going to finish my chores in time to get a good sleep. And I needed sleep because at dawn I was traveling to Javriel to sign up for the Imperial exam. I thought about running back to see if Jeppa was at the house. But even in normal times, leaving the herd unguarded for that long was reckless. With all the Rex sightings, it was unthinkable. Losing even a few stegos would be catastrophic for Elias's estate. Besides, the herd was still bellowing and gathering closer, and Ram was snarling at swaying tree branches. I stood up, hands running through my hair. I couldn't wait to pass the exam and move to Javriel. Then I'd never have to deal with Jeppa again. I jumped at warm breath on the back of my neck. I was already grabbing for my spear when I realized it was Dash. The herding raptor was half the size of Ram, with a lean build and auburn plumage. Her tail flicked playfully as she nipped at my hand. I patted her head on that spot behind her ears that she liked best. Dash ran back and forth between me and the herd. She was right. It was time to gather the herd for the night, even if I had to do it myself. I sent Dash, who shot off in her low-slung sprint around the stegos. I loved watching her work. She was so elegant in the field, changing directions, applying pressure at the perfect spot, moving stragglers with a glare. The stegos gathered more quickly than usual and seemed almost grateful for Dash to lead them to the night pen. I did another count. All the stegos were there, but Ram was nowhere to be seen. Strange. I gave Dash the command to keep the herd in place, then went down to search. Ram was at the pasture's far edge. His mane feathers flared, and his body was rigid as a statue. The silence stretched while I waited for Ram to turn with a final harumph. But he didn't. He ran further up the tree line, neck stiff and teeth exposed. I'd never seen him do that. It was now nearly dark. I was about to whistle for Ram to follow the herd when the bushes rustled. I paused long enough to convince myself it was the wind. A branch snapped. Then another. Trees shuddered along the field. Stillness. I stood on the pasture's granite outcropping, stomach sick and uncertain. Ram came streaking down the pasture, staring into the shadows with icy intensity before launching himself toward the tree line. Once there, his back arched and his throat rumbled in a way I'd never heard before. Behind me, the stego herd bleated and clustered, their spikeless tails twitching. I inched toward the guard raptor, spear point shaking. It was probably a raptor, just some puny, harmless raptor. Another crash from further up the tree line. Ram charged ahead. I stumbled after him before remembering to light the lantern at the end of my spear. My fumbling hands took several flint strikes to ignite the oil. The scant light of the orange flame exposed me against the surrounding dark. The forest was deathly quiet. I reached the spot where Ram pointed his snarling snout. Breath held, I plunged the lantern into the web of branches. Nothing. I wiped my brow and started whispering that everything was fine. The trees burst apart. Charging from an impossible height was a monstrous set of jaws lined with dagger teeth and topped with gleaming eyes. A Rex, an actual red Rex. Ram darted in front of the Rex, roaring with his bristling mane. For a moment, the Rex hesitated as the guard raptor blocked its path. This was my chance. But by the time I could force my feet forward, the Rex had knocked Ram aside with a sweep of its giant snout. My voice failed as I pushed the burning spear toward the Rex's face. The Rex stood, teeth glowing in the flame light, its yellow eyes focused to a pinpoint on me. The ground shook beneath its approaching steps. I found myself backpedaling from the monster, away from the stego herd. My foot slipped on the granite outcropping, sending me backward, over the edge.
The King's Messenger by Carolyn Clare Givens. Chapter 1. The King's Courtroom. His state is kingly, thousands at his bidding speed, and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve, who only stand and wait. From On His Blindness by John Milton. Smuggins stood as he had every day for years, ready, waiting, in the king's courtroom. The king's castle was the center of all the kingdom, perched high in its city, rising from the plains around it. Most of the king's people loved him, but there were rumors of unrest at the edges of the kingdom, north, east, west, and south. Some did not trust the king's goodness. Smuggins was a messenger for the king. He had one of the most prestigious positions in the land, but he'd never yet been called upon to go. The king's messengers were more than just pages who carried papers from one place to another. He found his messengers from among the people of his kingdom. Smuggins was never quite sure what the king had seen in him to ask him to become a messenger, but somehow he'd come to the king's attention, and here he stood. The messengers were the king's most trusted servants, and he made sure they were given training for whatever task he placed before them. Sometimes the task was tricky. The king would be conducting business with a trade partner, and he would call out, "Anagans, step forth." Anagans was the oldest and longest-serving of all the messengers. He negotiated business transactions with every major neighboring kingdom. Regally, he stepped forward and said, in his deep voice, "At your service, your majesty." The king said, "Anagans, I want you to take this businessman to one of the conference rooms and draw up a trade treaty for gold from his master's kingdom. You know what we have to offer in return. I shall review it when you are finished." Anagans bowed low, "Yes, your majesty," and regally led the businessman from the room. Sometimes the task was dangerous. The king would call out, "Coggins, step forth." Coggins stepped out from the line of messengers and said, "At your service, your majesty." "Coggins, this knight wishes to attempt to slay the dragon at the Cove of Alinar. I wish you to lead him there and assist him in his fight." Coggins had been trained to fight with 2 swords, as was the way of the land. His clipped, military-trained speech rang out, and he bowed his head and said, "Yes, your majesty," and gestured for the knight to follow as he strode from the courtroom. The king called out before Coggins and the knight reached the door, "Coggins, take care of yourself." Coggins turned back, bowed low, and said, "Yes, your majesty," before leading the knight to the armory and stables in preparation for their journey. Smuggins listened every day to these tasks, eager to know what kind of thing the king would call upon him to do. He was certain the king would call on him any day, and he said so to all the other messengers each night when they gathered for dinner. In his head he practiced again and again, intoning the words, "At your service, your majesty," and "Yes, your majesty." The tasks the king assigned his messengers ranged from the great matters of the kingdom to the small matters of his court. Sometimes he called out, "Sasha, step forth." Sasha stepped from the line and curtsied before the dais, saying, "At your service, your majesty." The tones of her voice always sounded like the melody of a song. "The grooms have told me that the feed for the horses is not the best quality available. Work with them and the household accountants to find something more suitable in the marketplace." "Yes, your majesty," Sasha sang before she danced from the courtroom into the stable yard. Smuggins had been a messenger since he was a boy, but he was still quite young. The whole kingdom knew he had never been sent, and it was always a matter of gossip. When he overheard whispers about himself, he tried not to listen, knowing that the other messengers had so much more experience than he, but it was hard not to hear what people said. "He must not look willing." "Oh, he must not stand straight enough to please the king." "Perhaps the king forgets about him." "Well, the king knows what he's doing, so it must be something wrong with Smuggins." Smuggins tried to ignore the whispers. He knew that the king knew each of his messengers by name: Anagins, Moggins, Coggins, Daggins, Sasha, Figgins, Smuggins, and Misha. Smuggins told himself that he was the youngest messenger but one, and that Misha had only been brought on quite recently, so it was no wonder that neither of them had been called upon. He stood tall among the line of messengers, along the outer edge of the king's courtroom. When the king needed him, he would be ready to step forward, saying, "At your service, your majesty," and he would obey whatever command he was given, saying, "Yes, your majesty," before walking from the courtroom, head held high. Oh, how he would burst with pride on that day. Until then, until that day when he could tell the king he was at his service, he knew it was his responsibility to look willing, to show the king he was ready. He kept his face up, hoping his expression seemed prepared. He made sure that he never behaved in any way that would damage the reputation of the king or the messengers. He never spoke evil of the king. One day the king called out, "Sasha, step forth," and nothing happened. In the silence that followed, the king looked over toward the line of messengers. Seeing Sasha missing, he called out, "Figgins, step forth." Figgins broke from the line and bowed low before saying in a high and reedy voice, "At your service, your majesty." "Where is Sasha?" the king asked. "She is ill, your majesty." "Ill? Oh dear." "Thank you, Figgins." The king motioned him back. "Yes, your majesty," Figgins answered as he stepped back into the line. The king looked over the whole line of messengers, considering them for a moment. Then he spoke again. "Misha, step forth." Smuggin's eyes widened. "Misha?" Misha stuttered a little as she answered, "At your service, your majesty." "Misha, take this tailor to the marketplace and show him the textile stall." "Yes, your majesty." And Misha led the tailor out of the courtroom, holding her tiny figure straight and tall as she walked. Smuggins was nearly reeling from the shock. Misha had been called. Misha! Before Smuggins! But he had been waiting all these long years. He had been ready for so long. Misha? Why, she hadn't even been a messenger for a whole year yet. Perhaps, Smuggins doubted for the very first time, perhaps he wasn't fit to be a messenger after all. And For just a moment, he bowed his head. It wasn't long before he raised it again and looked ready once more, but the king's sharp eyes caught the movement, and he smiled wisely to himself. The next day, all the messengers were lined up against the wall of the courtroom, eagerly awaiting their duties. The king called out, "Messengers, all of you, step forth." The messengers glanced at each other in bewilderment, and stepping forward, answered in unison, "At your service, your majesty." The king stood from his throne and stepped down from the dais into the court. He came to stand before the line of messengers. "I have a question to pose for you, messengers. Who among you is the greatest? Who is the most honorable, the most useful, the best at his task? I want you to answer one by one. Feel free to say it as yourself if you think you truly deserve the honor. I would like to hear what you have to say, for I wish to bestow a crown upon one of you." And he pulled a golden circlet from the folds of his robe. "Anagans, step forth and answer," he called out. Anagan stepped forth and opened his mouth. "Well, your majesty, as the oldest and longest serving of all your messengers, I believe it is my rightful place to be called the greatest and to receive the crown." And he stepped back. "Moggins, your answer." "Your majesty, well, if you remember, it was I who led your tradesmen to China and back, bringing with us the silk from which your robe is now fashioned. This act, I believe, qualifies me to receive the title greatest and the crown." "Daggins, step forth and answer," the king commanded. "Your majesty, it was I who accompanied you on the hunting trip, in which you caught the white stag. I carried your bow and quiver. This act shows I am the greatest and should receive the crown." "Coggins, your answer," the king called out. "Your majesty, I led the knight who killed the evil dragon at the Cove of Valinar. I risked my own life to go with him and save the kingdom from that horrible beast. This act most certainly qualifies me to be called the greatest and receive the crown." "Figgins, step forth and answer."
"Your majesty, it was I who accompanied the royal prince on his long search for the legendary nightingale, whose voice was more beautiful than the voices of the muses. I deserve the honor of being called greatest and receiving the crown."
"Sasha, your answer."
"Your majesty knows you have never sent me on great daring missions as some of these others, but I have daily done my duty around the palace and in the surrounding countryside. It is my faithful service for which I should receive the title and the crown."
"Smuggins, step forth and answer." There was a moment of silence. Smuggins knew he had nothing to say. He couldn't possibly compare his work to that of the other messengers. Even Misha had been sent on a task. Finally, though, he gathered his courage and stepped forward. Smuggins trembled as he spoke. "Your Majesty, I would find it very difficult to be in your position and choose between the great acts of the other messengers. They've really done all what they said. I don't know that I can say which one of them is the greatest, but it certainly is one of them." And he stepped back, shamefaced at not giving an eloquent answer like all the others. The king moved on. "Misha, your answer."
If you please, sir, your majesty, sir," Misha began, "I don't want to belittle all the wonderful things the others have done for you, for they really are wonderful. But, sir, your majesty, sir, I think, well, sir, you see, Smuggins has been ready to serve you his whole life, and you've never really called on him, but he's been ready, and I think Smuggins is the greatest," Misha finished in a rush. The king smiled his wise smile once more and said, "That's what I think, too." Smuggins looked up in amazement. "Me?" As the king put the golden circlet on Smuggins' head, he said, "Sometimes, Smuggins, it is those who wait
that have the hardest task.
Selected Poems from Beyond Chittering Cottage Poems of Place by Rachel S. Donahue. Therapy. Down by the creek where the salamanders creep and the water spiders all tiptoe, squats a boy on a log staring hard at the frog that he caught just a moment ago. Little toes take a dip where the bees take a sip, near the edge where the flowers bloom. And the bob of the curls on that pigtailed girl match the hum of her rhythmic tune. Farther up, where the stream crinkles on in a gleam over silt beds of slithering sleep, bends a teen stripped of socks, lifting hard at a rock for the dam that he's made in the deep. On a boulderous ledge in the shade of a hedge kneels a third boy in keen concentration, as he builds and he plans stony pyres with his hands for the joy of a calm contemplation. On the bank I'm alone, with a sigh and a groan for the grief and the pain of our nation. But around I behold the way beauty unfolds in the breath, in the beat of creation. Fishing. A great gray heron, with seasoned caution, stands poised, then takes a careful step. 2 Canada geese fly by, fussing like an old married couple, interrupting his silence. They skim the water and settle on the opposite shore, but their contentment doesn't last long. They soon bring their arguments back to where they started. Meanwhile, a dragonfly darts and hovers in indecision, forever trying to make up his mind if this is the better angle or that. A bullfrog near the tree line calls for everyone to clear the way as he hefts his weight, plunk-goop, into the water. Starlings chatter and gad about their little hotel party with no thought for who might overhear the conversation. They're too satisfied with the sound of their own voices to care. The fish alone are as still as the heron, stirring themselves only to taunt the sunburned humans who feed them worms. Summer. Bare-chested boys on the trampoline, a pebbles-haired girl by the water, the shady blue bench near the woods, learning French, and bright peals of thunder and laughter. The long lazy whine of cicadas, the flickering fireflies in flight, a tussle and shout of a bickering rout, and brightness that blinded our eyes. Adventurous books on the porch swing, vigorous games in the yard, creamy, cool rest when the heat is too blessed, and nights astronomically starred. Long verdant rows in the garden, hues of abundance in store, the time spent with friends toward lingering ends. This is what summer is for.
Thank you, listener, for joining us on this special episode. And as always, may you find bookish treasures in your wanderings off the beaten path. Thanks for listening in to our conversation today on the Banderpod. We hope you'll check out our full catalog at bandersnatchbooks.com. The Banderpod is produced by Rachel S. Donahue, A.B. Donahue, and Carolyn Claire Givens. Audio engineering by S.D.G. Morgan. Artwork by Evelyn Warnamundi. Many thanks to our friend Chris Slayton of Son of Laughter for our theme song, Cricket in a Jar. Find links and more in the show notes.